Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Farm Bill legislative briefing. I'm Jason Jordan, the Director of Policy at the American Planning Association. Glad you could join us for today's program. As the name clearly implies, we're going to be spending the next little while digging into the specifics of this year's Farm Bill reauthorization. We're going to walk through a number of slides here detailing what's in the measures passed by the House and the Senate and where we're likely to go next in this process. So with that, we're going to jump right in. I will, just as a housekeeping item, remind folks that we will take questions from the audience at the conclusion of the program. So you're welcome at any point during the program to go ahead and type in your questions in the GoToWebinar box that's on your screen. Be happy to get to those at the appropriate time in the program. Let me start with just a little bit of history for what the Farm Bill is. The use of this as a legislative vehicle to set agricultural policy dates back to 1933 when the first comprehensive farm policy bill was enacted. Since that point in time, we have had farm bills roughly on 5-year cycles. Obviously, there are plenty of examples of where reauthorization didn't have on time and there were short extensions, or maybe things happened a little bit earlier than that cycle. But generally, we're talking about 5-year cycles for these bills, although in recent years, that's been a little harder to maintain. But the real point I want to make here is that the name implies that this is just about farms and farming. In reality, this is the legislative vehicle that addresses a whole range of policy concerns well beyond just farms. Everything from our nutrition programs to rural development activities. It really does affect rural America in a big way, but it also has important elements that address communities of all sizes and locations. And as such, it is one of the more critical planning pieces of legislation. In a way, it's akin to what is known as the highway bill, but in fact covers transit and all sorts of other surface transportation programs. So the Farm Bill definitely affects farmers, but it affects all of us in very tangible and real ways. Our last Farm Bill was enacted in 2014, and so we are on track this year to have a new Farm Bill. The current version expires in just a few weeks' time, on September 30th. We have seen the House of Representatives and the Senate both pass legislation that will have to be reconciled by a conference committee before it can go to the president for signature. But the House and Senate went about this in very different manners, and you'll see that reflected when we get to the content slides, the content of what's in the legislation in just a few minutes. But even beyond the substance, just the process in both chambers was quite different. In the House, the first effort to pass a farm bill actually failed, didn't pass largely as a result of a controversy around immigration, but a combination of United Democrats and a handful of very conservative Republicans brought down the farm bill that was proposed. Then there were some changes made and some subsequent negotiations on immigration that led to a very narrow passage. 2 votes, in fact, separated the sides on passage. And largely, the controversy over the House bill centers around the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the SNAP program, the primary sort of nutrition program in the legislation. I'll get to the specifics of it in a few minutes, but essentially the House made some changes to SNAP that made it much more partisan, much more controversial. This is a piece of legislation that typically, well, let me say this, it doesn't always divide the parties cleanly, as you might guess, because there are different regions of the country with different agricultural needs and products. Sometimes these bills tend to fall more along regional lines in terms of support or opposition than they do along partisan lines. But this one, in the House at least, was extremely partisan in nature. The Senate stands in sharp contrast. The approach that was taken there was very intentionally bipartisan. The Agriculture Committee only wanted to move a bill to the floor that had broad support among both Republicans and Democrats, and that meant agreeing on a lot of compromises before the bill ever left committee. So very different approaches by the two chambers. As I mentioned, where we are now is that, and those bills were approved at the very end of July in both the House and the Senate. So we're now at the conference committee stage of the process, with not a whole lot of time for that conference committee to complete work, but we'll talk more about that toward the end of the program. Let me talk just for a quick second about the conferees. So the House has named all of their conferees, more than 40 of them from both parties. What you can see here on this slide are all of the Republicans who were named to the Farm Bill Conference Committee, split out by the different committees of partial jurisdiction that are involved in the overall legislation. I put the names up here, and I'll get to the Democrats in just a second, because as we talk at the end of today's program about the advocacy on planning priorities during the conference committee, these individuals become particularly important. So as you're looking over this list, I would urge you to think about, is your member of Congress represented here? If they are, then it gives you a uniquely important role in being an effective advocate on this legislation. Here's the list of Democrats, and this list will be available with all the slides, so you have a chance to go back and review it later. I would have a slide next that showed you all of the senators who had been appointed to the conference committee, but those names haven't been released yet. The Senate this week is still waiting to pass a resolution that formally names conferees, that takes the Senate to conference with the House. It's more of a formality. There are a lot of things on the floor this week, including some big appropriations bills and the renewal of flood insurance. So it's not quite clear when exactly we will get those names for certain, but they will be coming, and you can check the APA website for those names once they're available. And we'll update the Farm Bill blog post that's already there covering this issue. But what you can be certain of is that the two most pivotal members of the Senate delegation will be the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, Pat Roberts of Kansas, and Senator Stabenow from Michigan, the ranking Democrat on the Agriculture Committee. The way these conference committees typically operate is the chairman and ranking members of the primary committee of jurisdiction in both the House and the Senate are really the drivers of most of the policy decision making. And in fact, that so-called Big Four, the House chairman, the Senate chairman, the House ranking member, the Senate ranking member, have already begun negotiations. They had a formal meeting last week. Committee staff are already working on ironing out some of the details that will go into the conference. But do keep an eye out for those Senate names that are coming. But if you happen to hail from Michigan or Kansas, you can be certain that your senator will have a critical role to play in the final outcome. Let me turn now to talking a little bit about what's in the bills, the House bill and the Senate bill, and do a little comparing and contrasting. I will warn you that this is an area of policy that is laden with acronyms and program names. I mentioned before, these slides will be available, so you have a chance to go back and look at these. The blog post also provides a bit more detail, but I'm going to try to cover the big picture here, recognizing that there are certain elements in all of these components of the bill that I'll sort of have to gloss over for the sake of time. I'm going to start in conservation, which is one of the major titles of the bill, and an area where a lot of APA members work and have particular concerns. If you sort of scope out for a second and look at the approach taken by the two chambers, this is one of the titles that differ pretty dramatically from the House to the Senate. You can see that, first of all, in terms of overall funding, where the House bill cuts total funding by nearly $1 billion and moves that funding into other titles of the Farm Bill, whereas the Senate chose to keep the overall level of conservation funding constant. The other place you see it most dramatically is in relationship to the first program that's listed on the slide, the Conservation Stewardship Program. The House approach is essentially the elimination of CSP. It's not exactly elimination, because the approach is that they are taking that program and folding it into the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the EQIP program. But in reality, while that's a combination in the House bill, the way the EQIP program works, it takes away some of the key important features of CSP, particularly a comprehensive whole farm approach to conservation, as well as an eligibility threshold for based on conservation benefits for participation and some other aspects. So some important elements in CSP would be eliminated under the House provision, even though they would say that all of those are eligible under EQIP. The Senate keeps the program in its current status. It does add a handful of important policy improvements, particularly to working lands conservation programs, to bolster the coordination between EQIP and CSP, some other improvements on issues like cover crops and diversified crop rotations, and conservation planning. So in addition to maintaining the program, the Senate actually, from our point of view, improves the existing program. You will see this emerge as a theme, but in general, the Senate language is closer to existing APA policy positions and priorities. There will be a few areas where that's not the case, which I'll mention as we go through. But in general, if there's sort of one takeaway, it's that the Senate language is closer to a pro-planning agenda than the House language. So we're largely encouraging conferees to pick up that Senate language. So continuing on in terms of the conservation program, there is some changes made to the Conservation Reserve Program, where there's some cuts that the House makes, whereas the Senate actually adds some useful provisions, particularly related to water quality. One area that's particularly important for us is some changes proposed in the House bill related to the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, where the House eliminates a comprehensive planning requirement that we believe has made that program more effective. So again, it's another example of where the Senate is a better product from a planning perspective. One area in conservation where the House, in our view, did make a positive contribution is adding a requirement for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to do new measurements of the new assessments and measurements of the impact of conservation programs. Some of the data that they would collect and the measurements that they would do, we believe would be useful in a local and regional planning context, as well as help make the case overall for the impact of conservation programs. So that's one area where we hope conferees will pick up the Senate language. Let me shift from the conservation program. Again, happy to take questions later on in the program and talk a little bit about planning and food systems. This set of programs, of course, is where a lot of focus for APA has been in recent years. There was a food systems policy guide that was adopted a few years back. You might have been involved in some way with the APA Plan for Health initiative, which included a lot of focus on access to healthy food and healthy food planning. This is also an area of the Farm Bill that touches a broad swath of communities, urban communities, suburban communities, in addition to more rural areas. Some of the key elements here that I would call your attention to, the Senate has taken a much bolder approach to urban agriculture in the legislation. First of all, they would create a new office for urban agriculture at USDA. They would also create a new grant program aimed at urban, indoor, and innovative programs. So this is an area where we have been encouraging standalone legislation that largely mirrors the provisions that were in the Senate bill, and this is an important advance for USDA contained in the Senate language. The other sort of big headline story in planning and food systems that demonstrates sort of the different approaches taken by the House and the Senate is that the House actually cut what's known as mandatory funding for a range of existing programs. And what that means in practice is that it really undermines their ability to provide support, because they would have to compete for funding on a regular basis, whereas mandatory funding really sets them up able to guarantee continuous assistance. So the Senate takes the approach of actually pulling together a number of programs, and I'll list them off for you in just a second, into a new local agriculture market program with mandatory funding at $60 million per year. This would fold into it the farmers market and local food promotion program, the value-added producers grant program. It would include a new public-private partnership provision that would use federal resources to leverage private investment and encourage what they call a food shed level approach to developing regional food economies. So these are all things, programs that we have supported over time, as well as an approach that we have certainly supported. So this is an area where the Senate approach would take food systems planning in a positive direction, whereas the House approach of cutting mandatory funding would essentially eliminate the progress that had been made in those areas. So that's an important distinction between the two pieces of legislation. The Senate also creates a new Healthy Harvest, they call it, program that would be a produce prescription pilot. This is the use of prescriptions like you get from a doctor for prescription medication, but in this case focuses on produce and healthy food. One positive note for the House approach is that they included slightly higher funding for community food projects. So in terms of ironing out these differences, the Senate approach is better, but we'd certainly support the inclusion of the slightly higher funding for community food contained in the House. Both bills provide modest good news for the Food Insecurity Incentives Program. So both the House and the Senate increase that funding level for that particular program. Shifting now to the rural development component of the bill, this has always been an area of great importance for APA because rural development touches on a whole range of planning-related issues, from housing to infrastructure development to economic development. And so there's some important provisions here that I want to touch on here. Firstly, there's been controversy over the last few months because the Trump administration has attempted to eliminate the longstanding position in the USDA hierarchy of having an undersecretary for rural development. The Senate would actually overrule the administration and specifically require them in the statute to maintain an undersecretary position for rural development. This has been important for a lot of rural development interest groups, including APA, because of the sense that it's really important to continue to have that very senior level leadership on this topic inside the department. And the counter has been that even though the position went away, there would still be a focus and that person could report directly to the secretary and so forth. Our position has been that it's important to have that strong voice for rural development at the table at the undersecretary level. The Senate also creates some new programs that have a planning nexus in the rural development space, with a new interagency council on rural innovation and economic development to improve the approach across the federal portfolio to rural development issues. We also create a grant program for rural investment. The acronym here will be the RISE program, Rural Investment Stronger Economy Grants. The House historically has been strong on rural development, as you might expect, with a lot of members representing districts that would support rural development. And so there's some interesting provisions there, including one that would make some useful expansions to the rural broadband loan program, essentially creating more flexibility, as well as extending the use of that across all rural development programs at USDA. So some positive support for broadband. A kind of potentially modest change from some perspectives, but one that has generated some conversation, is a provision that would exclude incarcerated persons, so the prison population, from the population limits for rural development. In the House approach, this is a recognition that a lot of rural communities have chosen to have prisons located in their jurisdictions or nearby, and that sometimes the population of that institution may cause them not to qualify for certain USDA rural development programs. So this would exclude that population. There is some controversy there about whether or not it constitutes a sort of backdoor incentive for locating prisons there. We haven't taken a position on it one way or the other, but I did want to note it there, since I know many planners, would be part of dealing with those sorts of population metrics as it relates to potential grants and other sorts of programs. Both bills do expand a program at USDA called the Strategic Economic and Community Development Program, which has an important planning component to it. And so that is something that we see as a positive development in this title of the bill. I'm not going to talk in any detail really at all about commodity programs and nutrition, in part because this is an area of the legislation that sort of moves away from a lot of core planning concerns, although we certainly recognize that the structure of commodity assistance and certainly food assistance have a big impact on geographies and on development patterns and on things planners care about. But the details here are a little bit outside, a planning-specific portfolio. As I mentioned before, the biggest issue here is that the House has proposed tightening up work requirements for the SNAP program. And that is the major point of contention, particularly for Democrats, but some Republicans in the Senate as well, and is likely to be one of the major issues that has to be sorted out and fought over during this conference committee. The position that the Senate has taken is that there's simply not the votes, the 60 votes that would be needed to include that provision. Just remains to be seen how firmly the House of Representatives tries to hold on to that. There are some small differences, modest differences in the commodity programs, particularly on issues like payment limitations, risk management, and means testing for those commodity programs. And while they're modest and sort of technical in many respects, they can be very politically challenging because they tend to cleave along those regional lines that can cause some challenges. So while these two issues this is the shortest slide of the ones that I've shown so far, they're important issues because they really could influence the overall scope of negotiations and the ability to reach an acceptable compromise that can pass both chambers. In terms of sort of where we go from here, what I'd like to do is give you an idea of the outlook from our perspective, and then walk through some of those same programs to make it clear kind of what our key positions are, kind of program or provision by provision, to better equip you as an advocate for the agenda. In terms of the outlook, as I mentioned, that kind of core takeaway is that overall the Senate bill is much preferable to the House version as it relates to core planning concerns in conservation, food systems, and rural development. So while you'll see in the key positions that there are certain elements where the House has important and useful language, the kind of overall takeaway is that we prefer the Senate bill. We are at the stage where conference negotiations are underway, even though we don't completely have Senate conferees yet. That's expected to happen. The naming of conferees should happen this week, which would set them up for convening the conference committee in a formal way in early September. But we do expect that negotiations will happen over the month of August, even before that first formal convening of the conference committee, which makes August particularly important for communicating community perspectives and concerns on all the issues referenced in the legislation. And my colleague Emily Pazzi is going to talk a little bit about the advocacy side of this in just a couple minutes. I said at the outset that the current Farm Bill expires on September 30th. Leaders are still holding out some hope that conference negotiations could be wrapped up during the month of September to avoid any sort of short-term extension. But the reality is that may or may not happen. It's certainly possible, and if history is a guide, suggests it's perhaps likely that we could see some short-term extension of existing programs beyond September 30th if they can't have everything wrapped up on the overall bill. And I would say in general, the political outlook here is good. This is one of those areas where there are a lot of beneficiaries of these programs that cut across a whole lot of kinds of communities and partisan affiliations, which generally makes outlooks for farm bills pretty good. And I would say that neither party would relish the prospect of going into a midterm election with the farm bill still as unfinished business. So I think the politics are generally good, but there's no question this is tricky on a few fronts, and the SNAP issue is certainly one of them that will complicate the politics and make this more difficult to reach closure on. But again, I suspect there's enough will to get this done on both sides and in leadership that we will see a farm bill this year, if not before the expiration on September 30th. So on key positions here, and this is a little bit of repetition of the points that I was making on the programs as we went through the provisions, but just to be more clear about it. So in the conservation section of the bill, as it relates to CSP and EQIP, you see there on the screen the differences between the House and Senate approach that I referenced earlier. Our point of view and our position on this is to support the Senate version, and ideally rejecting the funding cuts. And by that, in this instance, what I mean is that while the Senate kept overall conservation programs level funded, they did shift some things around. So the easement program got a little bit of a bump up, while CSP and EQIP got a little bit of a cut in the Senate approach. So ideally, we'd like to see the Senate version on the programs, but without the cut in funding. We support the Senate approach on the agricultural conservation easement program, primarily as it relates to maintaining and improving regional and comprehensive planning as part of the program. We do, however, support the House language on conservation measurement, which shouldn't be too terribly controversial. It's not like the Senate opposes or takes a different approach. They just didn't include the language at all. So there is an opportunity, for the House language to be beneficial. Looking at food systems and food systems planning, we certainly support the efforts on urban agriculture. contained in the Senate version. There's no provisions on that in the House, but the Senate does create both the office and the grant program. We support the Senate language very strongly. This would fall in the category of a really high priority issue for us, of including that mandatory funding for the combined program that incorporates a whole range of food systems and farmers markets existing programs, as opposed to the House approach of eliminating. So that's a clear support. The Senate version, we support the Senate's idea of the produce prescription pilot program. The two areas where the House is marginally better would be on the community food projects initiative. You can see the relative amount of money here, at least in federal budget terms, is awfully modest. Even at $9 million per year, it's an extremely modest program. But nevertheless, the House version is preferable. Similarly, on the food insecurity program, the House funding being slightly higher would be the preference. Shifting to rural development, we support the Senate version on maintaining the undersecretary position for rural development. We support the language in both bills around the SECD program. On rural broadband, the House version, as I mentioned before, expands the eligibility. It adds a 10% broadband flexibility in the whole portfolio of rural development grants and loans. So that's a positive provision in the House bill. The Senate creating the Interagency Rural Development Council and the RISE program, we see those as beneficial. So we support the Senate version there. So once again, you can sort of see the general theme of preferring mostly the Senate language, while recognizing that there are some elements in the House bill that would improve the Farm Bill overall. So some other things to highlight here in terms of key positions. We certainly prefer the Senate version on SNAP, and ultimately I think the math in the Senate suggests that there's really no way forward other than maintaining the Senate language on SNAP. There simply aren't the votes to move it, at least at this stage, and it's hard to see them emerging in an election year in particular. And as I mentioned before, we're very focused on ensuring funding for the existing food systems programs overall, but there's an important little wrinkle. If we get Farm Bill extensions, there could be a lapse in funding for some of those programs if they're not specifically addressed in that extension. So that's an area we'll keep our eyes on should we end up in an extension scenario. One other issue I would highlight for you is that the Senate includes language that would extend the National Flood Insurance Program for a year. Congress has been working, I think we've had 7, or today the Senate passed another extension, so we'll have 7 short-term extensions of NFIP since the last full reauthorization. There have been a lot of efforts and proposals around reform. That's another area where we're engaged on issues of flood mapping and mitigation programs. But I think the reality is there's a recognition that Congress is going to need time beyond the election to sort this out. So the Congress acted today. The program actually expires at midnight today, but earlier today the Senate agreed to the House language to extend the program through November of this year. What the Senate language in the Farm Bill would do is just essentially give them time into the next Congress, which would just create a new deadline in 2019 for the flood insurance program. So I know that there are a lot of members who are very interested in what's happening on that front, so I wanted to be sure to mention that. Our anticipation is that NFIP extension would be included in the conference report. And with that as an overview of the legislative details, I'm going to turn the program over to Emily to talk a little bit about how you can be involved in ensuring that the provisions that are important for communities and good planning are included in that final conference report. Emily?
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. Emily Pazzi here, Public Affairs Manager with the policy team at APA. Well, now that you all have had a chance to go deep into the issues at play here, let's turn a little bit to talk about how you can influence the outcome of this particular conversation, the conference that is coming at us pretty quickly. So first of all, let me say welcome to August recess. What is August recess? It's the time when the lawmakers go back home to their districts and states and connect with constituents. Basically, it's a break from the legislative process. And fun fact, I actually learned this last night as I was prepping for the webinar. It was established in 1971. So there's your bit of legislative history for the day. The House actually left town last week on Thursday, July 26th, so they're already back in districts and states. The Senate is going to have an abbreviated recess this year. You may recall seeing news reports. Senator McConnell, the majority leader, made the call that senators were going to be in Washington for the majority of August recess this year. They do have a brief break coming up here for about a week, but they will be in Washington to work on some big issues that are still in play. But that said, this is still very much a time when planners like you have the opportunity to reach out with your legislators. This is a particularly an interesting August recess given the connection and the timeliness right before the midterms that will be occurring here in November. So with that, I want to focus on what the ground game is here this year for August recess. It's obviously connected to the Farm Bill. Jason talked a little bit about our messaging and our key positions, and that's all incredibly important as you think about reaching out to your elected officials with a particular ask. So here are some steps to a successful August recess from an individual advocate perspective. First things first, we want to know the ask, or we want to make sure that we know the ask, rather, and we want to understand what action items we are being asked to take. So in this instant, our main ask here to elected officials, both on the House and the Senate side, is to support the Senate version of the Farm Bill. You know, our key message there, overall, the Senate bill is better for planning. So our action item this year is to call your elected representatives and your senators, both of them, to let them know that you want them to support the Senate version of the bill. As far as action item goes, you might be wondering why we chose to go with making a phone call. You know, as advocates, you always have multiple engagement options. Of course, there's the action alert, which I think a lot of the folks on the line would be familiar with. There's also an option to meet with folks in person and to, of course, to engage with them on social media by commenting or mentioning them in a tweet. But something that's maybe sometimes pushed to the back, but just as effective we've seen in this administration particularly, is making a call to your member. And so I'm just going to walk you through best practices in terms of how to do that. Now, before we get to the actual phone call stage, though, we want to make sure we're prepping with APA resources. It's our job on the policy and advocacy team to make sure that you all have everything that you need to be able to be an effective advocate. And so this recess season, what that means is providing you all with a specific call script and some talking points to go out to your representatives and senators with. So that's in fact what we did, and in fact that's going to be rolling out in tomorrow's Interact email. So be sure to look specifically at the policy and advocacy section of that email, because there's going to be some information about the Farm Bill, just framing it up, the issues that we've been talking about today, and then there will also be a link to our very specifically tailored call script, as well as a blog post that gives you some best practices and things to be successful in your call. So a couple of notes on the call script. I think something that's really important is to remember to include your local examples. If you have relevant experience that really gets at the heart of the issues that we're talking about today, you want to make sure that you bring those up in the message that you leave with your elected official's office. Not only does it add that local flavor, but it also lends you credibility and establishes you as a constituent and someone who really understands what's at stake here. So I really encourage you to kind of do your homework before you go to make that call, have a chance to read through the phone script, and understand where, you know, you might be able to lend one or two personal stories in a very concise way that kind of elevate your message. And for what it's worth, I will say that since staffers receive such a high number of calls, of course, you know, it is their responsibility to make sure that they are listening to those, making note of them and tracking them and responding. But it really does help, and they can tell when you're being sincere and when you're really positioning yourself as an expert on something when you add that local flavor in those stories. So now that you've done your homework, you are ready to actually make the call. And remember, we're encouraging you to call both your representative and your senators. And I'll say, even if you know, your electeds weren't on the list that Jason shared earlier, at least on the House side, we're still waiting to find out about the Senate. That's okay. Your members still have an opportunity to influence folks who are kind of working as a part of that conference committee. So, you know, that's why it's so incredibly important that you use your voice and make sure that your opinion is heard. So when you're making the call, you can go one of two ways. You can feel free to call direct to your member's Washington, D.C. office. So DC office usually handles policy and legislative concerns, so it makes a lot of sense to call direct there, or you can go through the U.S. Capitol switchboard. In the case of the switchboard, when you call there, you're going to get an operator. They'll redirect you to the staff office. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're deciding which route you want to go. When you call the Washington office or when you're transferred from the switchboard to the office, you're going to get a staffer who answers. If you have an opportunity, be sure to ask for the agriculture staffer who handles that portfolio, but it's likely that they might not have time to chat on the phone right now, so it's very likely that you'll be asked just to leave a message, and that's perfectly fine. Again, as I mentioned a second ago, staffers are responsible for tracking all messages, so your note will get noticed. Just some general tips to keep in mind when you do make that phone call. Once you get a staffer and you're ready to leave that message, just remember 3 C's: stay calm, stay clear, stay concise. They have a lot going on in their office, so it's helpful if you can keep it short and to the point. I think you'll see that our script helps you to do that, but you'll also want to make sure to help you along in that process that you have the script printed out right in front of you. And if you're going to add those local examples, maybe just have a couple of notes there to help prompt you when you're leaving that message. Remember to clearly identify yourself. You know, you want to provide your name, you want to provide your address, but above all, you want to provide that you're a constituent. Constituents are the ones members want to hear from, so it helps, again, when they can correctly identify that, yes, you are someone who could potentially vote for them. And the final tip that I would just add is be courteous. Remember, these folks are dealing with a large numbers of constituents every day. They're on the front lines, and so it's really helpful and will go a long way if you're just kind as you're leaving your message. So once you leave your message, we need you to just do one more thing. Follow up with APA, with me. My email's there on the screen. We'll ask that you just let us know that you made the calls and who you talked to, because we're going to be keeping track on our end. And the reason why that's especially important is because this year we're issuing a challenge. We want to see planning advocates make 100 phone calls during the month of August to their members on this issue of on the Farm Bill. We think you can do it. If you break down those numbers, that should be a pretty easy lift, but we'll be watching closely and we'll report back at the end of August to let you know if we have accomplished that goal or not. Now, keep in mind, this is just one of several advocacy opportunities that you're going to have coming up this fall, all leading up to the midterms. The other ones being the Policy and Advocacy Conference, National Community Planning Month in October, and then, of course, that space in between the end of Planning Month and the midterm elections. And that's a perfect segue to our final slide of the deck, which is a quick plug of our 2018 Policy and Advocacy Conference. So this is, as you can see from the date there, coming up pretty quickly at the end of September. It's September 23rd through the 25th. You know, August recess is actually a really good time to brush up on your advocacy skills and your APA legislative priorities because it all leads up to the Policy and Advocacy Conference. So just for folks who may not have been to the conference before, it's a 3-day program as the date suggests. Day 1 is all about training. Day 2 is about deep dive sessions into policy issues. Those sessions normally touch on topics represented in APA's legislative priorities, but this year it's worth noting that there's going to be a really special emphasis on housing affordability, particularly how that relates to APA's action agenda for our multi-year housing campaign called Planning Home. And then the day 3 is what it all leads up to. That's Planners Day on Capitol Hill, and that's when you have a chance to meet with your reps and your senators one-on-one, and their staffs, of course, too, just to talk about the pressing issues that are top of mind for planners. APA handles setting up all of your meetings. We get you prepared with all of the documents and the information that you're going to need going into those meetings. But it's a really fantastic event, and last year was our biggest turnout ever, and so we're hoping to see that grow again this year. A quick note on Planners Day. We are going to have a Planners Day pre-briefing early in September. I think the date is Friday, September 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern. For folks who are participating in that day, it'll be a mini boot camp of sorts to get you prepped for everything that you need before you travel to Washington. But do just save the date for that and watch for communications about the conference soon. And with that, Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. Do hope everyone can join us for the Advocacy Conference in Washington in September. If you have questions, we've got a number of questions that have been submitted, but if other folks have questions, again, you can submit those through the toolbar. I'd be happy to get to those. So let me jump right in on some of the questions that we do have. There's a question here about whether the produce prescription program is based on the program in California, and yes, that is true. It is a pilot program in the legislation, relatively modest, only $4 million a year, but it is a full authorization with mandatory funding for this program. Again, it's going to be called, assuming it survives the final conference, the Harvesting Health Pilot is the name of the program. There's a further question here about whether or not there are changes to crop subsidies, and I'll try to touch on some of the differences here. The big difference on commodity programs between the two bills focuses on the rules for applying the annual per farm payment limitations that determine a farm's subsidy payment amount, and the adjusted gross income test that's also part of payment eligibility. There are a lot of specifics that we could go into there, but the general approach is that the House adds provisions that essentially create some loopholes to the existing payment limitation and income means test. On the other hand, largely led by Senator Grassley of Iowa, the Senate bill incorporates some provisions he has been pushing that actually narrows some of the existing loopholes to improve enforceability and to try to make the current $250,000 annual payment cap the real payment limit. There's also some Senate language that would address the adjusted gross income limitations as well. So that's one of the big ones. There are some other changes that are, again, modest when you look at them, but could potentially create some challenges across regional support for the bill. The House bill modestly increases commodity supports, while the Senate bill modestly reduces it. The House increases spending for the price loss coverage, which is a commodity subsidy, but decreases it for ag risk coverage, and the Senate takes the opposite approach, small cuts to price loss with some increases for risk coverage. There are some differences in the dairy program. I'll freely admit I don't know the dairy program well enough to unpack those for you, but there are some differences there. And there's a difference on crop insurance with some changes in the House bill that reduce risk management, education, and outreach. So those are the big differences in the commodity and crop insurance title. But again, I think it's the issue around the payment and income limits that are largely the biggest challenges in that title. I've got a few questions here about whether a recording of the program will be available. Absolutely. It does take us just a little bit of time to get this formatted for posting online, but the full slide deck and an audio recording is available. There's a further question here about whether there are any moves in the legislation to encourage smarter development. Obviously, that's a broad question and a little bit in the eye of the beholder. I guess I would argue that in general that the provisions that improve some of the conservation programs in the Senate bill potentially move us in that direction. Certainly better overall for land conservation, which is in part related to reducing sprawl and smarter development. I think overall the Senate's approach on improving food systems planning is another way that the bill could move overall policy in that direction. And then on the rural development side, there's probably less specifics to point to, but some of the interagency council, for instance, and improving some of the planning requirements would potentially be part and parcel of that. So those are all Senate side provisions in conservation and rural development that I think are perhaps modest movement in that direction, but important nevertheless. I think that covers the questions that we have been submitted so far. I will encourage folks, if there are issues that you didn't get enough detail on or you have more specific questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us directly. My email is jjordan@planning.org. Emily mentioned hers earlier, epozzi@planning.org. Do feel free to contact us. And if you don't follow APA advocates on Twitter, would certainly encourage you to do so. That's one source for getting updates as the conference committee gets underway and negotiations unfold. We also have blog posts that's up that will be regularly updating the blog to keep you apprised of new developments on this important legislation as we go forward to the expiration date of September 30th. With that, I will thank you for joining us for today's program. I'll thank you for being part of the Planners Advocacy Network, and we'll hopefully look forward to having you join us in Washington in a few weeks for the Policy and Advocacy Conference. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.